His voice fell like iron on stone, and she felt the weight of it settle in her bones. The hall held its breath. Every candle flame leaned away from him, as if even fire knew its place. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she did not lower her gaze. Not yet. The collar at her throat was cold, older than memory, and in that moment she understood. This was not a choice. It never had been. Before we dive into this story, leave your rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment reach your heart. The hall breathed like a caged beast. Night descended outside in veils of mist over the towers of the estate, and each window seemed a wound open to a moonless sky. Between columns of black marble and torches that burned with trembling flames, the nobles waited in silence. The air tasted metallic of fear and old wine. At the center, atop shadowed steps, he sat in his high-backed chair as if the throne itself were an extension of his bones. His presence was not human. Time obeyed him, and even fire hesitated in its light. She entered through the great doors at the far end of the hall. No sound announced her arrival beyond the faint chime of thin chains hanging from her wrists. Her name was whispered in the corridors like an echo without a face, a name no one dared pronounce aloud anymore. They said she had been brought from the ruins of the Southern Territories. Daughter of a prisoner and a soldier marked with a symbol no one understood, an iron collar, ancient and unadorned, locked around her neck since birth. The key had been lost generations ago. The servants turned their eyes away when she passed, not from contempt, but from premonition. There was a silence in her that the world feared, a silence that carried the memory of blood. When her eyes met his, the entire hall seemed to lose its breath. Those who watched, lords, councillors, matrons draped in velvet and judgment, shifted in discomfort, as if witnessing a sacrilege. He, the master of the Iron House, the ancient lord of the valleys and the dead, held the woman's gaze without altering the rhythm of his breathing. Around them the torch flames flickered. It had been centuries since anyone had looked at him this way. Not with defiance, but with a kind of tragic lucidity. "I need an heir, not love," he said, his voice low and spreading across the marble like cold water. The silence that followed was the sound of power, a sound that required no screaming. The woman did not respond. She only lowered her face slightly, not in submission, but in a gesture that seemed to hide an ancient pain. Her gaze, though bowed, still held a spark, as if to say she understood the price of those words more than he himself did. The councillors exchanged furtive glances. They knew what this meant: a choice, an inheritance, a forbidden act. That night, the wind infiltrated through broken stained glass and brought with it the damp smell of earth. Outside, the garden slept beneath the dead leaves of autumn, and each branch seemed to lean in to listen. The entire estate bowed to the decision that would be made in that instant. The master rose. His height cast shadow over those present. A cold ran across the floor, climbing up the legs of those who dared to witness. He descended a single step, and each footfall sounded like a sentence. Before him, the woman remained motionless. Her hands, marked by labor, trembled slightly, but not from fear. There was something sacred in that contained resistance, as if her body knew that her soul had already been broken 1,000 times and still would not bend. "They say you carry the blood of traitors," he murmured, approaching close enough that his voice was heard only by her. "But there is something in that gaze that does not belong to the living." She remained silent, and for an instant, it seemed the walls breathed with her. "Perhaps that is what I need," he completed, lower, as if speaking to himself. The matrons whispered, horrified. The councillors looked at one another, powerless. It was unthinkable that the Lord would choose a slave, a woman without name, without lineage, without the right to even raise her eyes before a noble. But what moved this man was not desire, it was necessity. The perpetuation of a bloodline that had already lost the pulse of life. An heir born of servitude and silence would be the exact mirror of his empire. In the days that followed, the estate plunged into rumour. She came to inhabit a room at the top of the eastern tower, where the wind sang like an exiled spirit. Each night she was brought to the Lord's presence and returned mute, without anyone knowing what had been said. The castle began to transform. The servants noticed the candles burning faster, shadows growing in the corridors, and even the mirror in the main hall became covered with a cloudy film, as if reflection itself refused to see. She, the slave, had become the center of an invisible storm. The women of the council ordered penances, the maids denied her their gaze, and the men feared that her mere presence would attract the judgment of the heavens. But she continued, always in silence, with the same collar fastened at her neck and the same firm posture, as if she carried the weight of fate and did not complain. One night, the clamor of bells broke the quiet. There was blood at the gates. A servant had been found dead, his throat marked by something that was not human. The estate awoke in terror, and at the top of the tower the master stared at the woman before him, his gaze darkened by a mixture of fury and fascination. "What are you?" he asked, not as accusation, but as surrender. She slowly raised her face. The torchlight revealed dried tears upon her skin. "What you have made of me," she answered in a low voice, without anger, without plea. The air seemed to stop. Outside, the wind ceased. He approached, and for an instant the shadows that surrounded him receded. What was seen then was neither tenderness nor violence, it was recognition. Two beings born of loss, confronting one another before a mirror the world would never understand. The following morning, the throne stood empty. They say the castle remained motionless for 7 days, until the doors opened and she descended alone, with the same collar at her neck, now covered by a thin layer of ash. No one dared to ask. They only bowed, as if sensing the beginning of a new era. And when the light of dawn touched her eyes, it seemed that for the first time in centuries, the estate breathed. Not from love, but from continuity. The heir, still invisible to the world, already existed in the silence between one word and another, in the space where power and sacrifice became the same thing. She had not chosen this path. The thought returned to her each dawn as she woke in the tower room, where frost formed patterns on the narrow window and the wind carried voices she could not decipher. In the world below, the estate moved according to rhythms she had learned to read from a distance. The changing of guards at dawn, the tolling of bells for meals, the lighting of torches as dusk approached. She had been a part of that machinery once, invisible among the other servants, her hands red from washing linens in icy water, her back bent from carrying wood. Now she was something else. Not elevated, not freed. Something suspended between states like smoke trapped in glass. The collar at her neck had become warmer. She noticed it first on the 3rd night after the announcement in the hall. Where once it had been cold iron, constant as stone, now it pulsed faintly with heat. She had touched it with cautious fingers, expecting pain, but found only warmth that seemed to spread through her veins like wine. In the mornings, she examined her reflection in a basin of water, searching for changes. Her eyes were the same grey they had always been, like winter sky. Her hair fell in the same dark waves, but something beneath the surface had shifted, some fundamental alteration she could not name. The Lord summoned her each evening as the shadows lengthened. A silent attendant would arrive at her door and she would follow through corridors that grew colder as they descended. The throne room was never empty when she arrived. He wanted witnesses to whatever was unfolding, though she understood the witnesses themselves did not comprehend what they saw. She would stand before the dais while he regarded her from his seat of carved blackwood, his face unreadable in the uncertain light. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes they remained in silence for long minutes while the councillors shifted and the matrons clutched their prayer beads. "You do not fear me," he said one evening, the words falling without preamble into the quiet. She considered this. Fear was too simple a word for what moved through her when she stood before him. It was more like standing at the edge of a vast cliff, feeling the pull of the drop, knowing one could fall or fly and not knowing which would come first. "Fear would change nothing," she said finally. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. Something flickered in his expression, gone too quickly to name. He rose from the throne and descended the steps with that particular grace that seemed wrong on a body so large, so anciently powerful. When he stood before her, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were dark, but not like night, like deep water where light goes to disappear. "You speak as if you have already accepted your death," he said quietly. I accepted that the day I was born with this. Her hand rose to touch the collar. Everything since has been borrowed time. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if reading a text in a language he had half forgotten. Then he reached out, and she held herself still as his fingers brushed the iron at her throat. His touch was cold, colder than the metal, and yet where his skin met hers, a strange heat bloomed. "Who bound you?" he asked. "I do not know. My mother never spoke of it. She died when I was young. And your father?" Dead before I could remember his face. His hand fell away. He turned from her, walking to the tall window that overlooked the gardens. Night had fallen completely now, and beyond the glass the world was a pattern of shadow and deeper shadow. "There are old magics," he said, speaking as if to the darkness outside, "that bind not just the body but the bloodline, curses that run deeper than bone. That collar is not iron." She felt something tighten in her chest. "What is it?" "A seal. A prison for something that was never meant to walk freely in this world." He turned back to face her. "Your mother was not simply a prisoner. She was a vessel, and you inherited what she carried." The room tilted. She reached out, grasping the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. The attendants stirred, but a slight gesture from the Lord kept them in place. What did she carry? The words scraped her throat. "That is what I intend to discover." He moved toward her again, and this time there was something almost like curiosity in his expression. "An heir of my blood would be powerful. An heir who also carries forgotten magic would be something this world has not seen in 1,000 years." Understanding crashed over her like cold water. He did not want her. He wanted what moved beneath her skin, what had been locked away by iron and ritual. She was not chosen for who she was, but for what slept inside her, some inheritance she had never known she possessed. "You cannot," she whispered. "I can. I will." No cruelty in his voice, only certainty. "But I will not force you. That would poison what I seek to create." He paused. "You may refuse. I will have you sent away to the northern territories where my reach is weak. You could live out your years in obscurity." She stared at him. It was a choice of a kind. Exile or transformation, freedom or power. And yet she understood that both paths led to the same essential loss of self. "What happens if I agree?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "The collar will open. What is inside you will wake, and we will see if you survive it." The attendants had begun to murmur now, unable to contain their shock. The matrons looked between one another with expressions of undisguised horror. One of the councillors, an old man with a grey beard that reached his belt, stepped forward. "My lord, this is madness." To unbind a sealed vessel without knowing what was imprisoned. Silence. The single word carried such weight that the councillor stumbled backward. "This is not your concern." The lord extended his hand toward her, palm upward. An offering, an invitation. She looked at that hand, pale as marble, marked with old scars that told stories she would never know. Then she looked at his face, searching for some sign of what he truly wanted, what moved him beneath the layers of power and control. What she saw there was hunger, but not the hunger of the body. It was the hunger of someone who had lived too long, who had seen empires rise and fall, who had grown weary of the endless repetition of days. He wanted change. Transformation, something to shatter the pattern of centuries. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, and the world contracted to that single point of contact. Heat rushed up her arm, and the collar at her throat began to burn, not with pain, but with a terrible awakening warmth. She gasped, and he caught her other hand, steadying her as her knees buckled. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice cutting through the rising roar in her ears. "Do not fight it. Let it rise." She tried to obey, pulling air into lungs that felt suddenly too small. The collar was white-hot now, and she could smell burning, though her skin remained unmarked. Around them, the torches flared higher, their flames turning strange colours, blue and green and violet. The councillors backed away. Several of the matrons fled. Through the pain and transformation, she felt him holding her steady. His grip was iron, unbreakable, and she clung to it like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The collar began to hum, a sound like distant thunder, and then it opened. The sound was a note of perfect clarity, like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. The two halves of the collar fell away, clattering on the marble floor, and something inside her chest expanded, unfurling like wings after a long captivity. She could see differently now. The hall was full of colours that had no names, lights that moved independent of the torches, currents of power that flowed through stone and air like invisible rivers. She could see the Lord before her, and he was no longer simply a man. He was a nexus of old magic. His body shot through with veins of silver light that pulsed with a rhythm older than heartbeats, and she could see herself reflected in his eyes. She was burning. Not with fire, but with something that resembled starlight, cold and ancient and utterly merciless. "What am I?" she breathed. His smile was terrible and beautiful. "You are awake." The days that followed existed in a haze of transformation. She learned quickly that the unsealing had not simply freed something within her, it had fundamentally altered her nature. Food tasted strange now, too vibrant or not vibrant enough. Sleep came in fragments, filled with dreams that felt more real than waking. And time itself seemed to move differently, sometimes racing, sometimes crawling, as if she existed slightly askew from the normal flow of hours. The Lord kept her close during this period, watching her changes with an attention that would have been disturbing if she had possessed the capacity for normal fear. But fear, like many other mortal emotions, had become distant. She could remember what it felt like to be afraid, but the feeling itself no longer touched her. He taught her in the evenings, in a chamber deep within the castle where the walls were lined with books in languages she could now somehow read. The knowledge flowed into her as if she had always possessed it, merely needed reminding. She learned that she carried the blood of an old race, one that had existed before humans claimed dominion over the world. Her mother's people had been healers and seers, but also warriors when necessity demanded. The collar had been placed on her bloodline as punishment for some ancient transgression, a way to prevent the gifts from manifesting. "Your kind could reshape flesh," the Lord told her one evening as they sat in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth. "Mend wounds that should have been fatal, draw sickness from the body like poison from a wound. But that same power could also unmake, could turn a man inside out with a thought." She looked at her hands, so ordinary in appearance. "I do not feel that power. You will. It wakes slowly, learning your shape from the inside." He paused. "The collar kept you human. Now you are becoming what you were always meant to be." "And you?" she asked. "What are you?" He smiled, and she saw the edge of something inhuman in it. "I am old. That is enough." But it was not enough, not for her. She studied him when he was not watching, noting the way he never cast a proper shadow, how his reflection in windows was always slightly wrong, displaced by a fraction of a second. She noticed how the servants gave him wide berth, how even the counselors who had served him for decades still flinched when he turned his attention their way. One night, she dreamed of blood. In the dream, she walked through the garden beneath a moon that was too large and too red. The flowers had all bloomed black and their petals fell like rain. The Lord was there, waiting by the fountain, and when he turned to face her, his eyes were empty hollows. "You will have to choose," he said in the dream. "What you were or what you are becoming?" She woke with the taste of copper in her mouth and found blood on her pillow. Not much, a thin line from her nose, but it frightened her in a way that nothing had frightened her since the unsealing. She was changing, yes, but into what? And at what cost? The answer came 3 weeks after the collar fell. She was walking in the garden at dusk when she heard screaming from the eastern wing. By the time she reached the source, a crowd had gathered. A young maid lay on the floor, convulsing, foam at her lips. The household physician knelt beside her, helpless. Without thinking, without planning, she pushed through the crowd and dropped to her knees beside the girl. She placed her hands on the maid's chest and felt the wrongness immediately. A blockage in the heart, a clot that was killing her by degrees. The power rose through her like a tide. Her hands grew hot, then burning, and light poured from her palms into the maid's body. She could feel the clot dissolving, the heart steadying its rhythm, the girl's breathing easing from desperate gasps to normal respiration. When it was done, she sat back, dizzy and spent. The maid opened her eyes and stared at her with an expression of wonder and terror. The crowd had gone silent. The physician was pale as milk. The Lord was there, standing at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met across the space, and she saw satisfaction in his gaze. This was what he had wanted. Proof that the power was real, that the unsealing had worked. That night, he came to her tower room for the first time. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and felt her pulse quicken despite herself. When he entered without knocking, she was standing by the window watching the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. "You saved her life," he said without preamble. "I did not think about it. I simply acted. Instinct, good." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "Your power will grow stronger. Within a year, you will be able to heal injuries that would kill 10 men. Within 10 years, you may be able to return the recently dead to life." "And the child?" she asked quietly. "The heir you need. Will I still be able to bear one?" "Yes, but the child will be like nothing this world has seen, carrying both our bloodlines, both forms of magic." He turned to look at her directly. "Are you ready for that?" She thought of the maid on the floor, the light pouring from her hands, the feeling of reaching into another person's body and rearranging the fundamental structures of life. She thought of what it would mean to bring a child into this world, a child who would inherit such terrible gifts. "No," she said honestly, "but I do not think readiness is possible for such things." His hand rose to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was cold and sent shivers down her spine, but she did not pull away. "You are braver than you believe," he said softly. "That is why I chose you. You chose me because of what I carry. I chose you because when you looked at me in that hall, you did not see a monster or a god. You saw a man who had lived too long and grown tired of being alone." His eyes held hers. "You saw me as I am. No one has done that in centuries." Her breath caught. There was vulnerability in those words. A crack in the armor he had worn for so long it had become his skin. And in that moment, she understood that he was as trapped as she had been. Imprisoned not by iron but by immortality, by the weight of endless years. "Then we are both prisoners," as she whispered. "Were," he corrected. "Now we are something else." He leaned forward, and she thought he might kiss her, but instead he pressed his forehead to hers. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing in sync, two beings from different worlds trying to understand how they had arrived at this improbable meeting. When he finally pulled away, his expression had settled back into its usual inscrutability. Rest. "Tomorrow we begin the true work." He left without explaining what he meant, and she stood alone in the tower room, feeling the vastness of what had been set in motion. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of mortals and immortals alike. She dreamed again that night, but this time the dream was different. She walked through a version of the estate that was overgrown with vines and flowers, where every stone glowed softly with inner light. A child played in the garden, a girl with dark hair and eyes that shifted between grey and gold. When the child saw her, she smiled and held up a flower made entirely of light. "Mother," the child said, and the word resonated through her chest like a plucked string. She woke with tears on her face and knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that the future had already begun to take shape. Whether she willed it or not, the wheels had been set in motion. An heir would come, the bloodlines would merge, and the world would change in ways neither she nor the Lord could fully predict. All she could do was walk forward into that unknown future, carrying whatever grace she could gather, hoping it would be enough to meet what was coming. The seasons turned, and with them came the slow unfolding of new realities. Winter arrived with sheets of ice that covered the windows and made the stone floors treacherous. The estate seemed to contract in the cold, pulling inward on itself like a living thing seeking warmth. She spent those short days in the library learning to read the old texts, absorbing knowledge that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. The power within her continued to grow, manifesting in unexpected ways. She could sense illness before it showed symptoms, could feel the health of every living thing in the castle like a vast web of light and shadow. When the stablemaster's son broke his arm, she set and healed the bone with a touch. When fever swept through the servants' quarters, she moved among them. drawing out the sickness until her own body burned with it, then releasing it harmlessly into the cold winter air. The household began to treat her differently. The fear remained, but mixed now with something approaching reverence. They called her my lady, though she had been given no title. They bowed when she passed. The matrons still whispered behind their hands, but they no longer dared to speak against her openly. The Lord watched her transformation with an attention that felt like pressure against her skin. He was present at the healings, observing, taking notes in a leather journal that never left his side. In the evenings, they would sit together in his private study and he would ask her questions. What did the power feel like? Could she sense the difference between natural illness and magical corruption? How far could she extend her awareness? She answered as honestly as she could, though there were aspects of her new nature that defied language. How could she explain the way she could feel the circulation of blood through bodies 3 rooms away? Or the sensation of touching the boundary between life and death, that membrane so thin it was almost transparent. "You are exceeding my expectations," he told her one evening as snow fell beyond the window. "Most unsealed vessels take years to reach your level of control." "Perhaps because I have no choice but to learn quickly," she replied, setting down the book she had been reading. "You have made it clear what you need from me." Something flickered across his face. Was it regret? But it passed too quickly to be certain. "I have not treated you gently." "No, but I am still alive." "That is more than many in my position could say." He rose and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered gardens. "There was another long ago. A woman I believed could be what you are now. I was wrong. The unsealing killed her within days." The admission surprised her. He so rarely spoke of the past, of the centuries that stretched behind him like an endless road. "What was she to you?" "Everything. Nothing. It is difficult to remember across so much time." He turned from the window. "I have learned since then to want less, to need more carefully, but you have reminded me what it feels like to hope." The vulnerability in his voice struck something deep within her. She stood and moved to join him at the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a small perfection, here and gone in an instant. "I am not her," she said quietly. "Whoever she was? No, you are yourself. That is what makes you dangerous." She looked at him sharply. "Dangerous to whom?" "To me." He met her gaze. "You make me want to be something other than what I am. That is the most dangerous magic of all." Before she could respond, he stepped away, putting distance between them as if proximity itself were a threat. "The council meets tomorrow. They will want to formalize our arrangement. There will be a ceremony." "What kind of ceremony?" "A binding, not of the body, but of intention and bloodline. It will announce to the household and the wider territories that you carry my heir." "But I do not." "Not yet." His smile was thin. "Intention precedes reality. The ceremony declares what will be." Magic responds to such declarations, she understood then. This was not simply about producing an heir. It was about reshaping possibility itself, using ritual and will to bend the future toward a specific outcome. It was a kind of sorcery, old and powerful, and she would be at its center. "Will it hurt?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Not physically. But it will bind you to me in ways that cannot easily be undone. Your life will be tied to mine, your power to my power. If I die, you will feel it. If I am weakened, so will you be." "That sounds like a curse." "It is an exchange. You will also have access to my strength, my knowledge, the accumulated power of my bloodline. And any child born of this union will inherit both our gifts fully, not diluted by mortal limitation." She turned the implications over in her mind. To be bound to him would mean surrendering a kind of autonomy she had only just begun to taste. But it would also mean protection, power, a position from which she could shape the world rather than simply being shaped by it. "Do I have a choice?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You always have a choice. But some choices close doors while others open them. This one does both." She nodded slowly. "Then I will do it. Not because I must, but because I choose to." Something in his expression softened. "That distinction matters more than you know." The ceremony took place 3 days later, in the great hall where she had first stood before him. But the hall had been transformed. Every surface was covered in white flowers, winter blooms that should not have been possible in the deep cold. Candles burned in elaborate arrangements, their flames steady despite the draughts that moved through the old stones. The nobles and councillors stood in a wide circle, their faces solemn. She wore white, a dress that had been commissioned for her by the Lord himself. It was simple in design but exquisite in execution, the fabric moving like water with every breath. Her hair had been left unbound, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. At her throat, where the collar had once rested, there was only smooth skin and the faint memory of heat. The Lord waited for her at the centre of the circle. He wore black, severe and unadorned except for a pendant at his throat, a stone that seemed to contain its own light, pulsing faintly in rhythm with his breathing. As she walked toward him, the crowd parted. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the weight of their judgment and wonder, but she kept her gaze fixed on him, on the still centre of all this ceremony. When she reached him, he extended both hands. She placed hers in his and immediately felt the hum of power between them. Like lightning seeking ground, an old woman stepped forward, one of the matrons, but ancient beyond any other, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes milky with cataracts. Yet when she spoke, her voice was clear as morning. We gather to witness a binding of bloodlines, a joining of powers that will shape generations yet unborn. Do you both come to this freely, without coercion, without regret? I do, the Lord said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. She swallowed, feeling the momentousness of what she was about to say. I do. The old woman produced a blade, silver, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Then let blood speak to blood and seal what words have begun. The Lord held out his right hand, palm up. The woman drew the blade across it and dark blood welled up, darker than any blood should be. Then she turned to her and she offered her own hand without hesitation. The pain was sharp, but brief. Join hands, the old woman commanded. Their bloodied palms met, and the world exploded into light. She felt his presence flood into her, centuries of memory of power, of carefully controlled hunger. She felt the weight of his loneliness, the burden of immortality, the endless watching as everything he knew turned to dust. But beneath that, deeper than thought, she felt something else. A desperate hope that she might be the thing that finally ended his isolation. And he felt her. She knew. Felt her confusion and determination, her newly awakened power still learning its own shape, her fear that she would fail at this impossible task. He felt the child within her that still mourned her lost mother, and the woman she was becoming who mourned nothing at all. The light grew brighter, and she heard herself crying out, though she could not have said whether from pain or ecstasy. Their joined hands burned with a heat that should have consumed them both, but instead it forged something new, a connection that ran deeper than blood, deeper than bone. When the light finally faded, she found herself on her knees, the Lord kneeling beside her. Their hands were still joined, but the wounds had healed, leaving only matching scars that glowed faintly silver. It is done, the old woman said, her voice heavy with satisfaction. They are bound. What comes from this union will reshape the order of things. The crowd erupted in a mixture of celebration and unease. Some cheered, others whispered prayers. The Lord helped her to her feet, and she swayed against him, dizzy from the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Can you walk?" he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "I think so." "Then let us leave this place. You need rest?" He guided her through the crowd, and she leaned on his strength, feeling it flow into her through the new bond. They climbed the stairs to her tower room, and he stayed with her as she collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Sleep," he said, brushing hair back from her face. "The bond will settle. Tomorrow you will feel different. Different how? Stronger, more certain, less alone." She wanted to ask more, but sleep was already pulling her under. The last thing she felt before darkness claimed her was his hand in hers, the silver scars warm against her skin. She dreamed of a child again, but this time the dream was clearer. The girl was older, perhaps 5 or 6, with eyes that held old knowledge. She sat in a garden filled with impossible flowers, and she was reading from a book, written in a language that existed only in dreams. "Mother," the child said without looking up, "do not be afraid. What is coming has always been meant to come." "What is coming?" she asked. The child smiled and turned a page. "Everything." When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and her body felt renewed. The bond with the Lord hummed quietly at the back of her awareness, a constant presence that was somehow both foreign and intimately familiar. She rose and went to the window, looking out over the snow-covered estate. Spring would come eventually. The ice would melt. Seeds buried deep would push toward the light. And in her own body, other seeds had been planted. Not yet life, but the promise of life. The possibility of something that would be neither wholly her nor wholly him, but a new thing entirely. She placed her hand over her stomach, feeling for changes that were still too small to register. But the bond let her sense deeper, let her feel the potential that waited there, patient as earth in winter. "Soon," she whispered to the child that did not yet exist. "Soon you will begin." And in the distance, as if in answer, the bells of the estate began to ring, not in mourning or celebration, but simply marking time, the endless progression of moments that would carry them all forward into whatever future was being written. The winter deepened before it broke. In the weeks following the binding ceremony, the estate settled into a new rhythm, adjusting to the altered reality of her presence. She was no longer simply the Lord's chosen vessel. She was bound to him in ways that the household could sense, even if they could not articulate. When she walked through the corridors, servants bowed deeper. When she entered a room, conversations stilled. The matrons no longer whispered their disapproval, at least not where she could hear. But the greatest change was internal. The bond allowed her to sense him always, a thread of awareness that ran between them regardless of distance. She could feel his moods like weather patterns, his rare contentment like a warming sun, his frequent contemplation like gathering clouds. And she knew he felt her in return, knew that nothing she experienced was truly private anymore. It should have been invasive, this constant presence in her mind. But instead, it was oddly comforting, like having a companion on a journey that had once been unbearably lonely. When doubt crept in during the long nights, she could feel his certainty steadying her. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her after particularly difficult healings, his strength would flow through the bond, sustaining her. They spent more time together now, not just in formal lessons, but in companionable silence. He would work at his desk, managing the affairs of the estate, while she read in the chair by the fire. Sometimes hours would pass without a word spoken between them, yet she never felt alone. The bond itself was a form of conversation, thoughts and feelings moving back and forth in a language deeper than speech. One evening, as sleet struck the windows and the fire burned low, he set down his pen and looked at her across the room. "You have been thinking about your mother," he said. It was not a question. She closed her book. "How did you know?" "The bond carries emotions. Yours has been colored with grief all day," she nodded slowly. "I was remembering something she used to say, that everything we lose becomes part of us in new ways. I did not understand it then. And now? Now I think she knew, about the collar, about what I carried. She must have felt it herself, felt the power pressing against the seal. Maybe that is what killed her, the constant pressure of being caged." He rose and came to sit on the chair across from hers. Or perhaps she survived as long as she did because she found ways to channel it, even with the seal in place. "Healing was in your blood even then. Your mother may have used it without knowing." The thought struck her with unexpected force. She had always believed her mother died of simple exhaustion, worn down by servitude and grief. But what if there had been more to it? What if every kindness, every small act of care had been a manifestation of power she could not fully access? "I wish I could ask her," she said quietly. "The dead do not answer. But you carry her in you, her blood, her gifts. In a way, she lives on in everything you do." She met his eyes across the firelight. "Is that comfort? Or simply the truth?" "Both. They are not mutually exclusive." They sat in silence for a while, the sleet continuing its percussion against the glass. Then he spoke again, his voice lower. "There is something you should know. About the heir we will create." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" The child will not be entirely mortal, cannot be, given what we both are. They will age slowly, live long, and they will carry gifts that may be difficult to control. I already understood that. No. He leaned forward, his expression grave. I mean, they will be dangerous. To others, yes, but also to themselves. Power of this magnitude in a young mind, one that has not yet learned restraint. It could destroy them before they reach adulthood. She felt cold despite the fire. Then what are we doing? Why bring such a being into existence? Because the alternative is watching everything we have built crumble into nothing. Because this bloodline, both yours and mine, cannot be allowed to end. Because sometimes we must create beauty knowing it will be brief and painful. He paused. And because I believe, despite everything, that life is worth the risk. She looked at her hands, at the silver scar that marked her palm. You are asking me to love a child while knowing they might not survive their own gifts. I am asking you to love them anyway, to give them whatever time they have. That is all any parent can do. The weight of it settled over her like snow. To bear a child was always to court grief. Every mother knew that. But to bear one marked from birth by such power, such potential for destruction. And yet, the dream returned to her, the vision of the dark-haired girl reading in the garden. There had been no sense of doom in that image, only calm certainty. Perhaps the future was not as fixed as fear made it seem. I will do it, she said finally. Not because I am unafraid, but because fear is not enough reason to refuse life. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, thumb brushing over the silver scar. That is why you will be a good mother. You do not let fear rule you. Neither do you, I think. No, I let other things rule me. Duty, ambition, the desire to leave something behind that matters. His grip tightened slightly. But with you, I have begun to feel something else. Something I had forgotten. What? He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, so softly she almost missed it. Hope. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and luminous. She squeezed his hand in response, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow, falling soft and silent over the darkened gardens. The first signs came in early spring, when the ice began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. She woke one morning feeling different, not ill, but altered, as if her body had begun speaking a language she was only beginning to understand. When she mentioned it to the Lord, he studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It has begun, he said simply. She knew immediately what he meant. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, though there was nothing to feel yet, no outward sign of the life beginning to take shape within. But through the bond, she could sense his certainty, and beneath that, a flicker of something that might have been joy. The household learned of it within days. Though neither of them made a formal announcement, servants had ways of knowing things, of reading the subtle shifts in attention and behavior that marked important changes. The physician was summoned to examine her, though she waved him away after only a brief consultation. I can sense what is happening inside me, she told him, better than any examination could reveal. The old woman who had officiated the binding ceremony came to see her, bringing herbs and strange tinctures that smelled of forest and ancient ritual. The child will need protection, she said, setting out her wares on the table. There are forces that will want to prevent such a birth, jealousies, both mortal and otherwise. She took the offerings gratefully, though she suspected her own power would be the greatest protection. Already she could feel the life inside her, tiny but fierce, like a spark that refused to be extinguished. Through the bond, she felt the Lord's constant vigilance, his awareness stretched out like a net to catch any threat before it could materialize. As the spring deepened and her body began to change, she found herself spending more time in the gardens, drawn to the growing things, the irrepressible push of life against death. The flowers responded to her presence, blooming more vigorously when she passed, reaching toward her as if seeking warmth. She learned to be careful where she walked, learned that her power now extended beyond healing into growth itself. One afternoon, as she sat beneath a flowering tree, the Lord found her there. He settled beside her on the grass, something he would never have done before, he who valued dignity and distance above all things. "You look content," he observed. "I am becoming. That is different from contentment, but it has its own satisfaction. The child grows well. Yes, I can feel them. Not thoughts, not yet, but something like intention, a will to exist." He placed his hand over hers, over the place where their child was forming. "I never thought I would see this. Another generation, a continuation. Were you lonely?" she asked. "In all those centuries before?" Lonely is too small a word. "I was absent, going through the motions of existence without truly inhabiting it." He looked at her, and in the afternoon light, his eyes seemed less dark, more simply human. "You have reminded me what it means to be present." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that would have been unthinkable months ago. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his arm coming around her shoulders. "What will we name them?" she asked. "We have time to decide that." "Tell me something true," she said, a strange urgency in her voice. "Tell me something you have never told anyone." He was silent for so long she thought he would refuse. "Then, I am afraid." "Of what?" "Of loving you both too much. Of finally having something that can be taken away." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I have spent centuries protecting myself from loss by refusing to care. You have undone that defense, both of you." She turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability etched in every line of his face. This ancient being, this creature of power and control, was terrified of the small life they had created together. "Love is always a risk," she said softly, "but it is also the only thing that makes existence bearable." "How do you know that? You who have known so little love in your life? Because its absence taught me its value. Because I have felt what it means to be unloved, and I will not let our child know that emptiness." He pulled her closer, and they sat like that for a long time, two beings from different worlds learning to inhabit the same present moment. Above them, the tree bloomed with an abundance that defied the season, petals falling around them like benediction. As summer approached and her body ripened with the growing child, she found herself becoming more powerful in ways that frightened even her. She could heal injuries that should have been impossible to survive. She could sense illness before it manifested, could trace the patterns of contagion through the household like following threads in a tapestry. And more than that, she had begun to sense the boundaries between life and death. That membrane growing thinner the more her power expanded. One night, she woke from a dream of standing at that boundary, looking across into the realm of the dead. In the dream, her mother had been there, young and whole, reaching out a hand. But when she tried to take it, the Lord's voice had called her back, and she had woken with tears on her face. He was beside her instantly, drawn by her distress through the bond. "What did you see?" "My mother. In the place where the dead go." His expression grew grave. "Your power is reaching toward necromancy. That is dangerous territory even for one as gifted as you." "I only want to speak with her, to ask her about the collar, about our bloodline." "The dead do not have answers for the living. They have moved beyond our concerns. But I could bring her back. I feel it. The power is there." He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. Necromancy always demands a price. To pull a soul back from death requires a sacrifice, usually of the caster's own life force. In your condition, attempting such magic would kill you. And the child." The words sobered her instantly. She had been so focused on the possibility of reunion that she had not considered the cost. "I would not risk them." "Good, because our child is more important than any ghost, even a beloved one." She nodded, but the longing remained, a dull ache in her chest. To be so close to such power and yet unable to use it felt like another kind of bondage. As if sensing her thoughts, he gentled his grip. "Your mother is at peace. Let her remain so. Focus on the life you carry, not the deaths you have survived." She knew he was right, but that night she dreamed again of boundaries and crossings, of voices calling from the other side. And in the morning, she found grey in her hair where none had been before. the first visible sign that power always extracted its price, whether wielded or merely contemplated. The summer passed in a haze of growth and preparation. A nursery was established in the tower, fitted with everything a child might need. The household moved into a state of expectation, waiting for the birth that would change everything. The Lord grew increasingly protective, his presence a constant shadow, watching for threats both mundane and magical. And through it all, she felt the child growing inside her, becoming more themselves with each passing day. Soon they would be born into this strange world, this place caught between ancient powers and uncertain futures. She hoped it would be enough. Her love, the Lord's protection, the strength they could offer. But in the quiet moments, when the bond allowed her to sense his deepest thoughts, she felt his fear mirroring her own. They were creating something unprecedented, something the world might not be ready to receive. And all they could do was wait and hope and prepare for whatever transformation was coming. The child would arrive with the first frost of autumn. She knew this with a certainty that came not from calculation, but from deeper knowledge, the kind that ran in blood and bone. The estate seemed to know it too. The household staff moved with increased purpose. The gardens bloomed one last time before winter's arrival, and even the stones of the castle seemed to hold their breath. Her body had become a mystery to her. Where once she had been thin from years of servitude and insufficient food, now she was round with life, her skin stretched tight over the miracle of creation. The child moved within her like a swimmer in an underground sea, and sometimes she could feel them testing their gifts already, small pulses of power that made her own magic flare in response. The Lord rarely left her side now. He had abandoned most of his duties to the council, trusting them to manage the estate's affairs while he focused entirely on her well-being. At night, he would place his hand over her stomach and close his eyes, using his ancient senses to monitor the child's development. They are strong, he would say, wonder coloring his voice. Stronger than they should be at this stage. Is that dangerous? It is unprecedented, but they seem stable, growing at their own pace. She had learned not to ask about the future. The Lord's foresight was limited where the child was concerned. Their existence created a blind spot in his perception, a knot in the timeline he could not see past. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what this new being would become. The first frost came on an evening when the sky burned orange and purple with sunset. She was in the tower room watching the colours deepen when the first pain struck. It was not like the labour pains she had heard other women describe. This was deeper, more fundamental, as if her body was being reorganised from the inside out. The Lord was there instantly, summoned by her distress through the bond. It is time? I think so. She gripped the window frame, breathing through another wave of pain. But something is wrong. It should not feel like this. He helped her to the bed, his face calm but his thoughts roaring anxiety through the bond. The child is not simply being born. They are transforming you as they emerge. Your body must change to allow their passage. Change how? I do not know. But trust it. Trust your power to protect you both. The physician arrived, along with the old woman who had performed the binding. They began their preparations, but she barely noticed them. Her entire awareness had turned inward, focused on the fundamental restructuring happening in her core. Hours passed. The pain came in waves that threatened to tear her apart, but between each wave she could feel the child, feel them struggling toward life with a determination that matched her own. The bond with the Lord became her anchor. His strength poured into her, sustaining her when her own threatened to fail. Midnight came and went. The household gathered outside her tower, holding vigil in the courtyard below. She could sense them through the walls, their prayers and fears mixing into a chorus of collective hope. And then, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the child arrived. The sound they made was not quite a cry, it was more like a note of music, pure and crystalline, that resonated through the stone itself. Every candle in the castle flared bright, then dimmed. Every sleeping person woke simultaneously. Every animal in the estate lifted its head and turned toward the tower. She held her daughter, for it was a girl, as she had somehow known it would be, and looked into eyes that were neither her grey nor the Lord's darkness, at something entirely new. They were gold, flecked with silver, and they held an awareness that should not have been possible in an infant. The Lord stood frozen beside the bed, staring at his daughter with an expression she had never seen on his face. If she had to name it, she would have called it awe. "What have we done?" he whispered. The old woman who had helped with the birth approached carefully, as if the child might shatter at any moment. She placed a hand near the infant's head, sensing rather than touching, and when she pulled back, her hand was trembling. "This child," she said slowly, "will reshape the order of things. I see it clearly now. She is neither mortal nor immortal, neither human nor other. She is a new thing entirely." The baby, their daughter, turned her head toward the sound of the old woman's voice and smiled. It was too knowing, too aware, and it sent a shiver through everyone present. "What do we call her?" the Lord asked, his voice rough with emotion she had never heard from him before. She looked down at the small face so perfect and so strange, and the name came to her fully formed. Aurora, because she brings light after darkness. The days following Aurora's birth existed in a suspended state, as if time itself had paused to observe what had been created. The tower room became a universe unto itself, containing the three of them in a bubble of firelight and whispered wonder. She learned the rhythms of her daughter quickly, the particular cry that meant hunger, the soft cooing that preceded sleep, the way those golden eyes would track movement with an intelligence that should not have belonged to an infant. But it was watching the Lord with Aurora that undid something in her chest. Some final walls she had not known she was still maintaining. This ancient being, who had ruled with cold authority for centuries, who had spoken of needing an heir with such clinical precision, now held their daughter as if she were made of morning mist. His large hands, which had commanded armies and signed death warrants, cradled the small body with a tenderness that made her throat tight. "You are afraid to love her," she said one evening, watching him rock Aurora by the window. The words came without planning, rising from the well of understanding the bond had created between them. He did not deny it. "I am afraid of what loving her will do to me. I have lived so long without this vulnerability. And now? Now I understand why mortals fear death so desperately, because I would die 1,000 times to keep her safe." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Both of you?" She rose from the bed, still weak from the birth but needing to be near them. When she reached his side, she placed her hand over his where it supported Aurora's head. "We are more fragile than you. Our time is limited in ways yours is not." "I know. That makes it worse." His voice was barely audible. "I will watch you both age. Watch you become vulnerable in ways I cannot prevent. And someday, perhaps centuries from now, I will stand alone again, carrying the memory of these days like a wound that never heals." She had no comfort to offer because he spoke truth. The reality of their situation was inescapable. She would die, Aurora would die, and he would remain. Unless the child inherited enough of his nature to survive beyond mortal span, but even that was uncertain. "Then we must make these years matter," she said finally. "We must fill them with enough light that the memory sustains you." Aurora stirred in his arms, making a small sound of contentment. Her tiny hand reached up and grasped his finger with surprising strength. When she opened her eyes, the gold in them seemed to pulse with inner light. "She knows you," she observed. "She understands more than an infant should. She is aware. I can sense it through my connection to her. Not thoughts precisely, but a kind of knowing, as if she remembers something from before birth." "Is that possible?" "With her, everything is possible. We have created something unprecedented. The rules that govern other beings may not apply." Over the following weeks, they learned the truth of his words. Aurora did not develop like other children. By her second week, she was holding her head steady. By the third, she was reaching for objects with purpose. Her eyes followed conversations, and sometimes her expression suggested she understood the words even if she could not yet speak them. The household was terrified of her. Servants would leave food and supplies at the tower door rather than enter. The few who dared to look upon her would pale and make warding signs. Only the old woman who had attended the birth came willingly, bringing herbs and charms. though she admitted freely that she did not know if they would work on such a child. "She exists outside the normal patterns," the old woman said, examining Aurora with a mixture of fear and fascination. "The magic in her is not stable. It pulses, changes, adapts. She will be powerful beyond measure, but also unpredictable." "Can you teach us how to guide her?" she asked, holding Aurora against her shoulder. "No one can teach you that. You must learn together, as she learns herself. All I can say is this: do not try to suppress her gifts. That way lies disaster. Better to teach her to channel them, to find harmony with what she is." After the old woman left, she and the Lord sat together in the deepening twilight, Aurora sleeping between them. The weight of responsibility pressed down like physical force. How did one raise a child who could potentially unmake reality with a thought? How did one teach restraint to a being whose power exceeded understanding? "I do not know how to be a father," the Lord admitted quietly. "I have ruled, commanded, destroyed, but nurturing, guiding, these are foreign to me. They are foreign to me as well. I had no parents who could teach me. We are both learning." He reached across Aurora's sleeping form and took her hand. The silver scars on their palms pressed together, and she felt the bond hum with shared uncertainty and determination. "Then we learn together," he said. "We make mistakes together. We protect her together. And we love her together," she added softly. "Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps love can fill the gaps where knowledge fails." His expression shifted, and she saw something crack open in him, some final reserve of emotional distance breaking apart. "I did not know I could feel this way. This fierce, protective instinct, this terror of failing her. It is overwhelming." "Welcome to parenthood," she said with a tired smile. "From what I understand, the terror never entirely fades." Aurora stirred, her small hand reaching up to grasp the air. Without thinking, they each offered a finger and the baby grasped them both, creating a connection between the three of them. In that moment, she felt something shift, not just in herself or the Lord, but in the fundamental nature of their relationship. They were no longer simply bound by ceremony and magic. They were a family, fragile and strange, but real. As the weeks became months, she witnessed the transformation in the Lord with something approaching wonder. The man who had spoken so coldly of needing an heir, who had approached their union as a transaction, now organized his entire existence around Aurora's needs. He learned to change soiled linens without flinching. He paced the tower room for hours when she was fussy, singing songs in languages so old she could not identify them. He made toys for her with his own hands, carving wooden figures and enchanting them to move and dance. But more than his actions, it was the subtle shifts in his demeanor that marked the change. He smiled more, not the thin, controlled expressions he had worn before, but genuine warmth that reached his eyes and softened his entire face. He laughed when Aurora did something unexpected, a sound of pure delight that she had never imagined hearing from him. And when he looked at her now, his gaze held not just desire or need, but something deeper and more complex. One evening, when Aurora was 4 months old and already showing signs of walking far earlier than should be possible, she found him standing by the window, watching the sunset with an expression of profound melancholy. "What troubles you?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "I am happy," he said, and his voice carried a note of devastation. "Truly deeply happy, and I cannot remember the last time I felt this. Perhaps I never have," she understood immediately. Happiness, when one had lived in its absence for centuries, could be its own form of grief, a reminder of all the years wasted in emotional winter. "Is that not a good thing?" she asked gently. "It is terrifying, because now I have something to lose. Now I understand what the poets meant when they wrote of joy and sorrow as twins. To feel one is to know the inevitability of the other." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "We could have decades together. Decades of this happiness. Is that not worth the eventual sorrow? I do not know. Ask me again when I am standing alone, centuries from now, remembering this conversation." He turned to face her fully. "But I would not unmake this. Would not go back. Even knowing the cost, I would choose this. Choose you. Choose her." The declaration hung between them, and she realized this was as close as he had come to speaking of love. He who was so ancient, so careful with words, could not quite voice the emotion directly, but she heard it in every syllable, felt it through the bond that connected them. "I would choose this too," she said. "Every moment, every difficulty, it is worth it." He pulled her close, and they stood like that as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged one by one. Behind them, Aurora made a sound of contentment in her sleep, as if approving of their unity. The following months brought new challenges and revelations. Aurora's power manifested in unpredictable bursts. Toys would float through the air when she was pleased. Plants would bloom or wither based on her moods. And once, when she was particularly upset, every mirror in the castle shattered simultaneously. They learned to read the signs, to sense when her magic was building toward an outburst, to help her channel it before it could cause harm. But they also discovered joy in the small moments that all parents treasured. Aurora's first word was not mother or father, but light, spoken clearly when she was 6 months old, while pointing at a candle. Her first steps came at 8 months, though she sometimes forgot about walking and simply floated where she wanted to go. And when she laughed, which was often, the sounds seemed to brighten the very air, making flowers bloom in the dead of winter. They took turns caring for her, developing rhythms and routines. She would nurse Aurora and sing to her, telling stories of her own mother, creating a lineage of memory. He would take Aurora to the library and read to her from ancient texts, his deep voice steady and soothing. And together the three of them would walk in the gardens, teaching Aurora the names of plants and birds, watching her interact with the natural world with a gentleness that belied her immense power. One afternoon, when Aurora was nearly a year old and speaking in full sentences that displayed frightening intelligence, she asked a question that stopped them both cold. "Why do people fear me?" They were in the garden, Aurora toddling between them while holding both their hands. The question came out of nowhere, delivered in her clear, precise voice. She and the Lord exchanged glances over their daughter's head. Through the bond, she felt his uncertainty matching her own. How did one explain fear to a child? How did one tell their daughter that her very existence challenged the order of the world? "People fear what they do not understand," she said finally, kneeling to Aurora's level. "You are special, different from other children." That difference can be frightening. Aurora's golden eyes studied her with that unnerving awareness. "But I do not wish to frighten anyone. I know, sweet one. But sometimes our mere existence is enough to unsettle others. It is not your fault." The Lord knelt as well, bringing himself to their daughter's height. "You will spend your life navigating this fear, learning to be yourself while also being mindful of how your power affects others. It is not fair, but it is the reality of what you are." "What am I?" Aurora asked, and the question held the weight of ages. He and she looked at each other again, and in that moment she felt the full force of their shared love for this strange, powerful, beautiful child. Whatever Aurora was, whatever she would become, they would face it together. "You are our daughter," she said firmly. "You are loved beyond measure, and you are exactly who you are meant to be." Aurora seemed to consider this, her small face serious. Then she smiled and the garden responded, every flower blooming brighter, every bird singing louder, the very air warming with her pleasure. "Then I will try to be worthy of that love," she said simply. The Lord made a sound that might have been a sob catching in his throat. She reached across and took his hand while keeping her other hand in Aurora's. The three of them remained there, kneeling in the garden path, connected by touch and bond and the fierce love that had transformed them all. That evening, after Aurora had fallen asleep, she and the Lord sat together by the fire. He was quieter than usual, his thoughts turbulent enough that she could feel them through the bond without trying. "What is it?" she asked softly. I was thinking about what she said. "About being worthy of love." He stared into the flames, as if love was something that must be earned, as if she could ever do anything that would make us love her less. She will learn that love is not transactional, that it simply is. Will she? When the world treats her as a threat? When people either fear or try to exploit her power? His hands clenched. I want to protect her from all of it, but I cannot. She will face cruelty, isolation, perhaps even violence, and I will be forced to watch, knowing my power cannot shield her from everything. She moved to sit beside him, leaning into his solid presence. We cannot protect her from the world, but we can give her the strength to face it. We can teach her that she is not alone, that she is loved, that her worth is not determined by others' fear. You speak with such certainty. Because I lived without that foundation, I know what its absence does to a soul. Aurora will not suffer that. We will make certain of it. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, feeling the quiet contentment that came from shared purpose and deep connection. I never expected this, he said eventually. Any of it. You, Aurora. This feeling of... He paused, searching for words. Completeness. As if I had been walking through centuries with a piece of myself missing, and only now have I found it. She tilted her head to look at him. Is that not what love is? Finding the pieces of yourself in others? Perhaps. He met her gaze. I have avoided speaking the word. It seemed too simple for what I feel. But I suppose there is no other term adequate to describe it. Her heart quickened. They had danced around this admission for months, communicating everything through action and bond, but never quite naming the emotion directly. Say it, she whispered. Even if it is simple, say it anyway. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I love you. Not because you gave me an heir, though I am grateful. Not because of your power or your strength, though I admire both. But because you made me remember what it means to be more than just ancient. You reminded me how to live, not merely exist. Tears blurred her vision. I love you too. I think I have since that first night, when you looked at me and saw not a slave but a person. You were the first to truly see me. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing passion. It was different from the first times, different from the ceremony and ritual that had brought them together. This was choice pure and simple. This was love acknowledged and claimed. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, she smiled against his lips. We have become quite the conventional family, have we not? Parents in love, devoted to their child. How ordinary, he laughed quietly. There is nothing ordinary about us, but perhaps that makes the ordinary moments all the more precious. They went to bed that night wrapped around each other, and for the first time since Aurora's birth, they made love not from necessity or duty, but from simple desire and deep affection. It was tender and slow, a relearning of each other's bodies, a celebration of the bond that went far deeper than flesh. Afterward, lying tangled, together in the darkness, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was what she had been seeking without knowing. Not freedom from servitude, not power or status, but this: connection, love, belonging. She had found her place in the world. And it was here, in this bed, with this man in this tower where their daughter slept. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? For choosing me, for seeing me, for loving me. His arms tightened around her. It is I who should thank you. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever, the ability to feel, to hope, to love. They drifted towards sleep together, and in her last conscious moments, she heard Aurora's soft breathing from the cradle nearby, the sound of their daughter's dreams mixing with the whisper of the wind beyond the window. It was a lullaby of sorts, a promise that tomorrow would come and they would face it together, as they now faced everything, as a family, imperfect and strange, but bound by love that was real and fierce and true. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Aurora's power continued to grow, requiring constant vigilance and creative solutions. The household never quite lost its fear of her, though over time it was tempered by familiarity and, in some cases, grudging affection. The outside world remained largely ignorant of her existence. The Lord ensured that rumors were suppressed, that Aurora remained a secret known only to those within the estate's walls. But within those walls, within the tower and the gardens and the rooms they inhabited together, a different kind of magic flourished. The magic of ordinary life made extraordinary by love. Aurora grew not at the rate of normal children, but according to her own mysterious timeline. She learned to control her gifts with a discipline that astounded them both, and she thrived under the careful nurturing of two parents who, despite their own uncertainties, loved her with a fierceness that needed no magic to be felt. And so, the family they had become, strange and powerful and impossible, learned to exist in the spaces between ordinary and extraordinary. They built a life together, moment by moment, day by day. They made mistakes and learned from them. They faced fears and overcame them. And through it all, the bond between them deepened, became unshakable, became the foundation on which everything else was built. She had been a slave, marked and nameless, with no future beyond servitude. Now she was mother, healer, beloved. She had found her name in the eyes of her daughter and her husband. Yes, she thought of him that way now, though no second ceremony had ever taken place. He was hers and she was his, and together they were Aurora's parents. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Aurora turned 5 in the spring, though by mortal reckoning she should have been 3. Time moved strangely around her, and they had long since stopped trying to measure her development against normal children. She was tall for her age, with her mother's dark hair and features that seemed to shift between both parents depending on the light. But it was her eyes that marked her as different. Those gold and silver orbs that saw too much, understood too, deeply and occasionally flickered with power that made even her father step back in caution. She had begun asking questions that neither of them could answer. Where did power come from? Why did some people have it and others did not? What happened to the soul when the body died? The questions came in her clear, precise voice, usually at moments when they were least prepared, during meals, while walking in the garden, in the quiet moments before sleep. She is searching for her place in the order of things, the Lord said one evening, after Aurora had asked whether she would live as long as he did. They were in his study, the one room in the castle where Aurora was not allowed without permission, where they could speak freely about concerns they did not want their daughter to overhear. "What did you tell her?" she asked, pouring wine for them both. It was a ritual they had developed, this evening time alone while Aurora slept, where they could be simply themselves rather than parents constantly vigilant. The truth, that I do not know, that she is unprecedented, and her lifespan may be as well. He accepted the wine but did not drink, staring instead into its dark depths. She did not cry or become upset. She simply nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She is too accepting of uncertainty. Most children would have pressed for reassurance. She is not most children. She never will be. He finally lifted the glass to his lips. Sometimes I wonder if we have done her a disservice, keeping her so isolated. She has no peers, no friends, beyond us and the handful of servants brave enough to interact with her. The concern had been growing in both of them for months. Aurora was lonely. She never said so directly, but they could see it in the way she created imaginary companions from light and shadow, in how she would spend hours talking to the birds and flowers as if they could answer back. She needed more than 2 parents, no matter how devoted. "The village," she said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "There are children there. Perhaps if we took her, carefully, allowed her to observe from a distance. Too dangerous. If anyone realized what she is, no one would know. She has learned to control the visible manifestations of her power. She could pass for an unusual child, nothing more." She leaned forward, urgency in her voice. She needs to see how others live, to understand the world beyond these walls. Otherwise, how will she ever learn to exist in it? He was silent for a long time, turning the idea over in his mind. She could feel his resistance through the bond, but also his recognition that she was right. Aurora could not remain locked away forever. "We would need precautions," he said finally. "Wards to dampen her power, instructions on how to behave, and I would accompany you both, though at a distance. You think I cannot protect her alone? I think you are powerful, but you have never faced a mob of frightened humans. I have. They are dangerous when afraid, and they will fear her if they sense what she is. She could not argue with his experience. Then we do it carefully. We make a plan. We give our daughter a glimpse of the ordinary world. They told Aurora the next morning over breakfast. Her reaction was not the excitement they expected, but rather a careful consideration that seemed far too mature for her years. "Will the other children like me?" she asked, her voice small in a way it rarely was. "Some might. Others might not. That is the nature of meeting new people," she answered honestly. "But you will not know unless you try." What if I frighten them by accident? What if my power manifests and I cannot control it? The Lord knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Your mother and I will be there. We will not let anything happen that you cannot handle. But Aurora, you must understand, you cannot use your power around the other children no matter what happens. Can you promise that?" Aurora's eyes flickered, with something that might have been fear or might have been determination. "I promise I will be very, very careful." The preparations took a week. The Lord crafted small charms that Aurora wore as bracelets, designed to absorb excess power and prevent accidental manifestations. They practiced interactions, teaching her how to introduce herself, how to respond to questions, how to play games she had only read about in books, and they discussed repeatedly what to do if something went wrong. The day they chose was a market day, when the village would be full of people and a few strangers would not draw particular attention. She dressed Aurora in simple clothes, nothing that would mark her as nobility or wealth. They left the castle in a small carriage, and with each mile that passed, she felt Aurora's excitement and nervousness building through her own connection to her daughter. The village was exactly as she remembered from her own childhood in similar places, small houses clustered around a central square, vendors calling out their wares, children running between the stalls while their parents shopped. The sounds and smells washed over them, and she saw Aurora's eyes widen with wonder. They walked slowly through the market, Aurora between them, holding both their hands. People glanced at them but looked away quickly. The Lord's presence commanded that response even when he was trying to appear ordinary. She felt him projecting a subtle aversion, a magic that made people not want to look too closely at their family. Near the edge of the square, a group of children played a game with a ball, their laughter bright in the afternoon air. Aurora stopped, watching them with an intensity that made her concerned. "Would you like to join them?" she asked quietly. Aurora nodded but did not move. She was afraid, she realized. This child who could unmake reality with a thought was terrified of approaching ordinary children. "I will come with you," she said, squeezing Aurora's hand. She glanced at the Lord, who nodded and moved to lean against a nearby wall, watching but giving them space. They approached the children slowly. There were perhaps 6 or 7 of them, ranging in age from about 4 to 8. One of the older girls noticed them first, a child with red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose. "Hello," the girl said, her tone curious but not unfriendly. "Are you new here?" Aurora looked up at her, then back at the girl. She seemed frozen, and for a moment nothing happened. Then she gathered herself and spoke. "We are visiting. My name is Aurora." "That is a pretty name. I am Margaret." The girl studied Aurora with frank interest. "Do you want to play with us? We are playing catch." Aurora glanced at her for permission. She nodded encouragingly, and Aurora slowly released her hand and moved toward the group. Margaret showed her how the game worked, and within minutes, Aurora was running and laughing with the other children, the ball flying between them. She moved back to stand beside the Lord, watching their daughter play. Through the bond, she could feel his mixture of pride and protective anxiety. "She is doing well," she murmured. "For now, but watch the smaller boy, the one with dark hair. He is wary of her." She focused on the child he indicated and saw it was true. While the others had accepted Aurora readily, this one hung back, watching her with narrowed eyes. When the ball rolled to him, he picked it up but did not throw it to Aurora, choosing another child instead. Children could sense what adults missed. That boy felt something wrong about Aurora, even if he could not name it. The game continued for perhaps 20 minutes. Aurora was radiant with joy, and several times she had to remind herself that this was the same child who could split stone with a thought. Here, she was simply a little girl playing with peers, experiencing the ordinary magic of childhood. Then the accident happened. One of the older boys threw the ball too hard and it struck Aurora in the face. Not with enough force to truly hurt, but enough to startle her and bring tears to her eyes. She stumbled back, and in that moment of surprise and pain, her control slipped. The air around her shimmered. The bracelets on her wrists glowed bright enough to be visible. And every bird in the square took flight simultaneously, as if responding to a signal only they could hear. The children stopped playing. Margaret looked at Aurora with confusion shifting toward fear. The wary boy took several steps back, his expression hardening into something that would become hatred if given time to grow. She moved quickly, reaching Aurora in seconds and pulling her close. "We should go," she said quietly. But Aurora was looking at the other children, at the way they were backing away from her now, the way Margaret's friendly expression had closed off into uncertainty. "I am sorry," Aurora said, her voice trembling. "I did not mean to—" "It is all right," Margaret interrupted, but her tone had changed. She was being polite now, not friendly. "Perhaps we will see you another time." The dismissal was clear. The other children had already begun to drift away back to their game, but now they played with frequent glances in Aurora's direction. The magic was broken. The Lord was there then, his hand on Aurora's shoulder. "Come, we have been here long enough." They walked back through the market in silence, Aurora between them once more, but now her head was bowed and her shoulders slumped. She did not cry, but something worse than tears emanated from her, a deep, quiet grief that made her own chest ache in sympathy. When they reached the carriage and were safely away from observing eyes, Aurora finally spoke. "They were afraid of me, just like the servants, just like everyone." "Not everyone," she said firmly, pulling Aurora onto her lap. "Your father and I are not afraid of you. You should be. I am dangerous. I cannot even play a simple game without my power manifesting." The Lord climbed into the carriage and sat across from them. His expression was complicated, mixing anger at the children's rejection with acknowledgement of the harsh reality they all faced. "You are 5 years old," he said quietly, "and you are managing power that would destroy most adults. What happened today was not failure, Aurora. You controlled yourself for nearly half an hour in a completely new situation. That is remarkable." "But not enough," Aurora said, and the maturity in her voice was heartbreaking. "It will never be enough. I will always be the strange one, the dangerous one, the one people fear." She exchanged a glance with the Lord over their daughter's head. They both knew Aurora was right. This was the reality of her existence. She would always be other, always be set apart. No amount of control or careful presentation would change the fundamental fact that she was different in ways that terrified ordinary people. "Then we teach you to be strong enough to bear that burden," she said finally. "We teach you that being different does not mean being less. That fear from others does not define your worth." "How do you know that?" Aurora asked, tilting her head back to look at her. "You were a slave. People must have looked at you with contempt." The observations struck home. Yes, they did. And I learned that my worth came from within, not from their judgment. You will learn the same. Aurora was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then she said in a voice so small it barely carried, "But I am lonely. I want friends. I want someone besides you and Father who does not fear me." The Lord leaned forward and took Aurora's hand. "Then we will find them. It may take time and they may be as unusual as you are, but they exist. Somewhere in this wide world, people who will see your power and not flinch. Who will understand what you are and love you anyway. Do you promise?" He hesitated, and she loved him for not offering empty reassurance. "I promise we will never stop trying." That is all any parent can promise. Aurora nodded slowly, accepting this conditional promise. She curled against her mother's chest, and they rode the rest of the way home in silence, each of them processing the day's hard lessons. That evening, after Aurora had finally fallen asleep, she and the Lord sat together by the fire in their bedroom. Neither had spoken much since returning to the castle, both lost in their own thoughts about what the day had revealed. "We failed her," she said finally, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. "No, we showed her reality. That is not failure. She is a child. She should be allowed innocence, happiness, the simple joy of playing with others. She will never have simple anything. The sooner she understands that, the better prepared she will be." His voice was harsh, but she could feel through the bond that he was grieving too, mourning the normal childhood Aurora would never have. She moved from her chair to sit beside him, leaning into his solid presence. "I hate this. I hate that the world cannot make space for her. The world makes space for nothing it does not understand. That has always been true." He wrapped his arm around her. "But we make space for her. In this castle, in our hearts, in the life we build together. That will have to be enough." "Is it enough for a child to have only her parents?" "It was enough for you." The words struck her silent. He was right. She had survived with less. No parents who loved her, no safe haven, no one who saw her worth. Aurora had infinitely more than she had possessed at that age. "Then we make it enough," she said firmly. "We fill her life with so much love and purpose that the lack of ordinary friendship becomes bearable. And when she grows older, when she begins to truly understand what she has been denied, then we face that when it comes. We do not borrow tomorrow's grief." She turned to look at him directly. "Today was difficult, but Aurora is strong. She will learn to carry her difference with grace, just as we have learned to carry ours." He studied her face for a long moment, then leaned forward to kiss her forehead. "How did I exist before you? How did I survive all those centuries without your wisdom to steady me? You endured, but now you live. There is a difference." They sat together long into the night, holding each other while the fire burned down to embers, taking comfort in their connection while their daughter slept down the hall, dreaming of a world that might never fully accept her, but learning to be strong enough to exist in it anyway. If this story found a reflection in you, leave a comment and share it. Sometimes the quietest pain is the most human.